Dim the lights. Let the room fall quiet. Imagine the Nile at dusk, turning to hammered bronze. The air warm with incense and dust. The city of Thebes. Wasset to those who lived there, breathing like a living god. It is the month of Akhet, the inundation, late in the reign of Seti, rolling toward the age of Rameses II, c. 1290–1288 BCE. The river is full and generous. The fields wait. The temples of Amun rise like mountains of carved light. And somewhere inside that forest of columns, a girl learns how quickly holiness can harden into a wall. They called her Neferet, the beautiful and true, dedicated as a child to Amun's house the year the flood came early, c. 1290 BCE. She grew beneath the shadow of Karnak's pylons, her feet learning the cold of limestone, her voice trained to the pitch of hymns. The priests told her that innocence is not only a state but a service, a gift bound to duty. To most, Thebes roared with life. Markets, cymbals, reed flutes, laughter spilled into streets. To Neferet, it pulsed through a lattice window, a moving world she could touch only with her eyes. On the 15th day of the Opet festival, attested in the New Kingdom, especially under Hatshepsut and Rameses II, the sacred bark of Amun drifted from Karnak to Luxor along a river made of firelight and voices. The oracle's veil trembled. Incense climbed. Neferet stood behind the screen of her chamber, as she had been taught, as she had been praised for doing, and saw something that would unmake her, a face in the crowd, ink-stained, sun-browned, a scribe's hands and a listener's eyes, Kimu. He bowed with the rest, but his gaze stayed a heartbeat too long. It was nothing, and it was everything. The look struck her like an omen, like a question the gods had never allowed her to ask. That night, when the oil lamps drew rings of gold around the columns and the city turned to a whisper, she lay awake and discovered the most dangerous prayer in Egypt. What if purity is not obedience, but truth? She tried to answer it with work, with ritual, with silence. In the weeks after Opet, she found new duties, real, invented, borrowed, to carry her through the courtyards where Kimu copied account rolls and temple letters, where he smiled without presumption the way a man smiles at a sunrise he doesn't dare touch. Their words were small. Water? Scrolls? May the god favor your hand. But in those careful syllables, Neferet learned the shape of rebellion. Love, in a house that punished desire, grew like lotus in silt. Quiet, rooted, unstoppable. Dates make death feel honest. So remember this. In the year the flood receded later than the court predicted, c. 1289 BCE, during the month of Pereu, when the fields first showed their green, the temple began to whisper. Servants cut their eyes away. Priestesses left offerings at doorways and would not say her name. The high priest of Amun, Rahotep, her father by blood and then by doctrine, summoned her only in public now, his voice clipped into formalities. He who had lifted her as a child before the god's image would not meet her eyes. He did not need to. The law of the house looked for him. It started like this. A servant girl, Iset, small as a shadow, slipped through a side passage at dawn and spoke without raising her head. They are gathering tonight, lady. They say the god has been offended. She didn't have to say why. The temple did not need proof to build a charge. It needed a door to close and a mouth to bind. That evening, as the sun set behind the western necropolis where millions slept, the chants rose. They were not the hymns the city knew. No bright praise for Amun-Re. No swelling gratitude for the flood. These words were narrow and cold, stitched from fear, purify, restore, cleanse the house. Neferet stood before the basin of truth. Yes, that was its name, set before the dais like a placid eye. If the water moves under the god's gaze, the guilt is revealed. You can hear the trap in that, can't you? If the water stirs, she is guilty. If it is still, then she must prove she did not enchant it into stillness. Either way, the hands that want her gone will call it divine. Do you confess? Rahotep's voice broke on the stone like a reed in wind. He had trained it all his life to be even. Now it was even still, but with a crack running through it. Neferet did not confess, not in the language they wanted. If I have erred, let the gods speak, she said, the way the honest say when everything they own is already in the other person's hands. She touched the water. For the length of one short breath, it held like glass. Then a tremor ran across the surface, caused by a draft, a hidden hand, the settling of old stone, or a god who never needed a reason. Gasps. Judgments. The verdict announced itself with the authority of men who no longer remembered how to doubt. Listen to the dates again. Toward the end of Pere, in the year C. 1289 BCE, before sunrise, they took her down. Beneath the pylons, past the storage rooms where barley and incense slept, deeper, down the damp throat of the temple's belly. The chamber was simple. Jars of oils, baskets of linen, painted eyes that follow you because that's what paint does in a circle of firelight. You know this room from every museum case you've ever peered into. The tools meant for the dead. She understood, finally and utterly, what restoration meant in a mouth determined to obey. Not forgiveness. Removal. The women who had dressed her for feast days carried the linens, their hands shaking. The high priest. Your mind insists he is only her father and nothing else. But he is also the law. Stood beside the lector priest in his leopard skin. Her flesh must be sealed so that sin does not spread. A sentence that sounds like care until you place a body inside it. Layer by oiled layer, the temple made her into an object. Arms bound to the ribs, ribs to the torso. Linen crosses the throat, the jaw, the head. Resin poured over the chest until the heart learned to beat like a bird under amber. If you have ever been held too tight for too long, you know a splinter of what she felt. She tried to speak her father's name. The chant swallowed it. He turned his face because belief can hide behind ritual and call itself duty. When the last strip pressed against her lips, she cried. A single tear slid into linen. A priest brushed it away like dust. Imagine being erased a thumbprint at a time. They set amulets at the places a body fears to lose itself. The throat, the heart, the belly. They spoke of protection and journey, of the field of reeds and the weighing of the heart against Ma'at's feather, as if she were already on the other side. But the air in her lungs disagreed. They sealed the chamber. Stone against stone. Mirror. Silence. Above her, Thebes woke. Markets opened, children ran. The bark of a moon gleamed again in the morning. No one in the square would have believed that a living girl had become a sacred object while they bought figs and haggled over fish. That is how power works best. Noiselessly. With liturgy for a blanket. Put a pin in this year, C. 1288 BCE, it will matter later. The flood came on time. The harvest did not fail. The archives note donations and grain counts, not the exact weight of a daughter on her father's sleep. The priests wrote purity prayers on lintels. Rahotep avoided the lower halls, then dreamed of footsteps. Servants whispered that the dead were restless. scratching sounds. A breath trapped where breath did not belong. The lector priest called it superstition. Amun's house prefers orderly miracles. When Rahotep finally took a lamp and went down alone, his shadows multiplied. The wall where the entry had been sealed gave nothing back. The light found only its own edges. He put his hands on the stone and said the only prayer that wasn't in the book. He asked her to forgive him, to forgive a man so practiced at obedience that he mistook it for love. Stone, you already know, is an excellent listener and a poor friend. Centuries will pass. Dates will stack like mud bricks. Someone from far away will open this place with tools and words Neferet never learned. They will write unusual in a neat notebook. They will describe a mouth frozen open, not in peace but in protest. They will guess at ritual. They will argue about accident and intention, about sacrifice and law, and they will miss, at least for a moment, the simplest line carved into the wall beside her. Offered to the god to cleanse sin. History will call that inscription context. You and I should call it what it is, a confession. But we are not there yet. We are still in the dark, with a girl whose heartbeat pounds under resin. We are still before the archaeology and the papers and the quiet display case. We are still listening to the way the temple breathes at night. If you were there, standing with Rahotep in that lower passage with your lamp stuttering, what would you do? Would you break the wall? Would you risk blasphemy for blood? Would you call obedience holy if it cost you your child? Hold that question. Keep it like a coal in your hand. We'll need it when the sand begins to move. Let the room stay dim. Keep that coal-hot question in your palm. Now step back into Thebes, the city whose streets never truly sleep, where rumor travels faster than boats on the flood. In the season of Pare turning toward Shemu, c. 1288 BCE, while temple drums kept time for the harvest rites, a single name passed in whispers through beer houses and scribal courts. Neferet, not as a priestess, as a warning. Kimu heard it first at the House of Life near Karnak's eastern wall, where students learned to make papyrus speak. Ink pooled in the groove of his reed pen when a courier said lightly, as if he were commenting on the weather, "The high priest has restored purity to Amun's house." The words were careful, the way men step around a sleeping crocodile. "How?" Kimu asked, mouth dry. The courier shrugged. "The god knows his own," which is a way of saying, "Don't ask again." Kimu did not sleep that night. He walked the shoreline where the Nile swelled against moorings, counting the pilings like beads. He thought of the first time he had seen her, how the festival made the whole city glow, and how her eyes, looking through the temple lattice, had looked exactly like a person who has discovered a sky where a ceiling was supposed to be. He had said nothing then because sometimes silence feels like devotion. He understood now that sometimes silence is just fear in a ceremonial robe. Dates matter. In the third month of Pare, c. 1288 BCE, an audit of temple grain rations brought Kimu inside the complex at dusk. A half-dozen scribes walked with him, their tablets clacking like teeth. Torchlight stuttered over reliefs of kings presenting mat to Amun. The air-down corridor smelled of myrrh and damp stone. The group paused at a sealed side passage. New limestone faced over old, and a lector priest muttered a short protective spell as if the wall itself had a throat that might answer. "Why do we ward a wall?" Kimu said, too quietly, and the scribe behind him kicked his ankle. "Do not look where a god has put a lid." Still, when the audit ended, he lingered. He knew the nightly patterns, when the Medjay guards changed, when the incense girls crossed the court, when Rahotep left the inner halls and walked the roof to recite his prayers to constellations that look like bulls and boats. He waited until the last hymn folded into the columns, then slid behind a rank of storage jars and into an older corridor where wind had not been for years. He did not move like a rescuer. He moved like a scribe, counting, noting, naming the cracks in the plaster as if the right word might open stone. At the sealed place, he set his lamp on the floor and placed his ear to the cold surface. Nothing. Of course, nothing. But the absence of sound can be a sound when you expect otherwise. It roared through his bones. He brought both hands to the seam where new stone kissed old. The lime binder scratched his skin. He worked a reed stylus in, then the horn handle of his penknife, then flat slate chips he'd found by the dump heap. A thumb of plaster flicked free. He stopped, sweat ice cold, and listened again. Still nothing. "Lady," he said, and in Egyptian the word can mean wife or lord's daughter or simply the person you lift your eyes to. Neferet. He had never said her name alone in the dark before. It felt like stealing. It felt like prayer. Footfalls. He doused the lamp with a damp cloth and flattened himself into shadow as two priests passed with a box of amulets swaddled in linen. They spoke the way men do when they want to sound like a wall themselves. Smooth, impersonal, carved by doctrine. Rahotep has not slept. He chose duty. He will be remembered for it. In stone, the other said. You know what stone remembers best? The pressure of the hand that laid it, and the face of the one buried behind it. Kimu kept coming back. Night after night through late Pare and into early Shemu, still 1288 BCE, when the river drops and the fields begin to bake. He smuggled in a tiny bronze chisel he swore belonged to the carpenter's shed. He tucked it into a basket of reed cord. He opened a little wound at the wall's edge, covered it with a jar when he left. Every day he wrote numbers and dates onto clean tablets with neat columns for barley, oil, and meat, and every night he tried to unwrite a single decree. Above him, Rahotep performed the rites exactly. That is how you survive long enough to become powerful. You do everything exactly. But the exactness had turned against him. The man who had made his voice even had to work not to scream when he walked past the sealed corridor. Once, this is recorded only in the heart, he touched the stone with both palms and said her childhood nickname. Once he almost ordered it opened. Then he remembered the gaze of a king and the mouth of a god and the law he had spent a life becoming. Obedience wears a face in Thebes. It looks very much like his. News from the wider world drifted over the city like pollen. The army sent reports from the delta. Traders from Byblos brought cedar and gossip. Setidwarn's name was carved on fresh stele. Talk of the Prince Rameses being tall for his age, a detail mothers remembered, mixed with talk of new storehouses at Pi Rameses in the north, a detail men who love power remembered. None of it touched the chamber where no air moved. Then one night, date it, first month of Shemu, c. 1288 BCE, Kimu pried loose a stone the size of his palm. Air breathed. Not much. Not like a man waking, more like a tomb sighing when it remembers being a hill. He set the lamp close, fine dust, a hint of resin. He whispered again, the way you do to a person you hope is asleep rather than gone. Nefaret? It's Kimu. The name sounded strange in the throat of a man who had made his life neat. It left a smear of mud on neatness and made it human. Silence answered. Silence can be a god too. He should have stopped. He should have accepted the wall's theology and let Thebes keep its face uncracked. Instead, he came back the next night with a water skin and a plan made of hope and ignorance. If he could open a hole big enough for air, if she still breathed, if he could bribe the right guard, if he could get her to the river under a moon that hid its face. How many ifs does defiance need? All of them. This time footsteps found him before he could hide. Not the measured pace of priests. Faster. The lamp flare caught bronze. Medjay, 2. No, 3. "Who are you?" one said, and it was not a question looking for an answer. It was a lever testing whether the stone beneath it would crack. "A scribe," Kimu said, too honestly, which is its own kind of lie. "What do you write in walls?" A fourth figure stepped into the light. The leopard skin told him who it was before the face did. Rahotep looked older in the lamplight, as if the night itself had written lines into him. Kimu bowed to the floor. "High priest, I came to steal what the god has taken." Rahotep's voice was soft. Soft can be worse than loud. "To breathe where breath has been forbidden," Kimu said before wisdom could stop him. The Medjay shifted their grips. "Leave us," Rahotep told them. They glanced at one another, the glance men share when doctrine meets something messier, and withdrew to the bend in the corridor. "What did she say to you?" Rahotep asked, eyes on the torn plaster. "Nothing," Kimu said. "We never—" He stopped, and the truth arrived in his mouth like a long-delayed boat. "We looked at the world and saw it could be larger than a lattice." Rahotep closed his eyes. The lines in his face looked carved with a bronze stylus. "You do not know what it is to be altar and man at once." "Then choose man," Kimu said, and the echo of it made him brave and terrified all at once. "Do you think I have not tried?" Rahotep said, so quietly that a moth would have to lean closer to hear. He pressed his palm to the breach. "I hear her when I sleep," he said. "In dreams she breathes, and I count with her. I count until morning." He opened his hand. Dust lined the whorls like a second set of fingerprints. "What you are doing cannot save her." Kimu did not say the obvious, that nothing could. He pointed instead at the lamp's shimmer on resin dust. "Then let it save you." There are moments when a life takes its true shape. They rarely look like triumph. They look like a man in a corridor, choosing which kind of silence will own him. Rahotep lifted his hand from the wall and turned away. "Go home, scribe. Write honestly somewhere the god can read without shame." Kimu did not go home. The next day, the sealed place bore a fresh smear of plaster. A hand had mended the wound. The temple always heals itself first. Weeks slid into months. The Shemu heat hammered the fields flat. Grain came into the granaries with its usual comforting arithmetic. Offerings tallied, oaths renewed. The king's seed festival plans whispered at the edge of every conversation. Longevity dressed as ceremony. In the west, the necropolis absorbed carpenters' songs as new tomb shafts deepened. In the east, Thebes wore its normal face. Kimu began to write the only rebellion available to a man with a pen. In the margins of inventories where no one looked, he recorded small indecencies. A jar of oil diverted from a widow. A field hand whipped past the legal count. A priest taking 3 loaves when 2 were allotted. The day and month when the basin of truth trembled, though there was no wind. He wrote dates because power hates calendars that do not belong to it. He wrote names because forgetting always begins by erasing them. At night, he walked the river and whispered stories to the water like a man sharpening a blade he isn't sure he'll ever have to use. He imagined a day when a boy would find one of his tablets where a floor had collapsed, read the tight, right-leaning hand, and understand that someone had tried to tell the truth in a city built to outlast it. Time turned. Seti I waned. The prince became a king with a name the stonecutters loved to chisel. User Matra Setapenre Rameses II, accession C on 1279 BCE. Thebes kept breathing. The Opet festival swelled like a drum again, the bark glittering like a moving constellation. Kimu stood at the edges of the procession as if sunlight might argue with regret. On the roof of Karnak, Rahotep watched the same procession and did not see it. He had discovered a new liturgy, counting, practiced without witnesses. He counted the nights since the sealing. He counted the breaths in his dreams. He counted the ways a man can fail a daughter and still be called holy. Then, one night in Akhet, not long after Ramesses' accession, c. 1279 BCE, wind moved wrong. It came from the east, dry and full of knives. Sand climbed the temple's outer walls and hissed through cracks like speech. A storm rose, the kind that makes even priests look up from their scrolls because gods are louder in dust. A section of the eastern storage court, old stone beneath newer, shuddered. A thin ground sound went through Karnak like a plucked string. A corner caved, just a little, the way a man leans when a secret is too heavy. In the lower passage, dust lifted from a seam and danced. Kimu reached the temple before dawn. He was not the only one. Magi with their faces wrapped, workmen with baskets, priests holding amulets as if a charm could hold back a hill. Rahotep stood bareheaded, which is a scandal. The wind had taken his headdress and flung it into a court full of broken pottery. They shored the corner. They chanted. They measured cracks with strings and knots. The lector priest sprinkled natron as if the wind might take offense and apologize. Kimu took 3 steps he had no right to take and found himself again before the sealed place. The plaster line held. The air tasted of resin and iron. "High priest," Kimu said, not bowing because there is a point at which the body refuses choreography. If the god wanted her forever, he would not send a storm to move the stone. "The god sent a storm to test us," a priest snapped. "To test you," Kimu said softly, eyes on Rahotep. "There are stories in Egypt where gods test men and men pass. There are fewer where men test gods and live." Rahotep closed his eyes the way a man closes them before walking into sun. "Open it," he said. 3 syllables, an unmaking. The priests froze. The Medjay looked like statues asked to weep. The lector priest began a protest and swallowed it, because even doctrine respects a voice that has finally chosen man over altar. They worked quickly, because doubt moves like water. The first stone came free, then a second. Air exhaled, the trapped, sweet stale breath of oils and linen and time. The lamp found curves of jars, a low table, a smear of hardened resin, the gleam of gold foils pressed to amulets, and a shape on a slab that had long ago ceased to be simply a body and had become a sentence. They did not find breath. This is not a miracle story. This is a reckoning. But they found a mouth open, not arranged by embalmers, but pulled by the body's last command to live. They found arms bound too close to the chest, fingers curled like the end of a fight. They found the resin shield over the heart unbroken, telling the cruelest truth gently. She had been alive long enough to turn still by inches. Rahotep stepped forward. The world did not fall on him. No lightning, only the sound of wind and a man's breath failing to be steady. He touched 2 fingers to the linen at her temple, the way he had once touched 2 fingers to her brow, as a father blessing a child before sleep. He said her name in full, Neferet Ma'am, beautiful and true, and for the first time since the sealing, called himself by his other name out loud, Father. No one wrote what he said next, but the wall heard it. Stone remembers pressure best. They did not parade her through the city. They did not dare to make a ritual of their crime. They set a barge at night and crossed to the west bank where the desert begins and memory gains altars of its own. They opened a small shaft away from the grand avenues of the kings. They laid her with the amulets the first chamber had given, those lies transmuted now into apologies. The lector priest spoke the chapter 125 words about hearts and feathers without understanding that theirs were the ones being weighed. Kimu wrote a different text that no god had commissioned. On a shard of broken storage jar, cheap, anonymous, impossible to inventory, he scratched a line in the cramped, right-leaning hand he used for numbers. Year 1 of User Matre Setepenre, c. 1279 BCE, Akhet. They opened a wall made for silence and found the truth. Not a sin, a girl. Let any who read remember her name, Neferet. He tucked the shard beneath the head niche where the linen would never quite stop smelling of resin and myrrh. When they filled the shaft, the wind had already calmed. Thebes resumed. It always does. The bark glided. Grain was weighed. The king's titulary multiplied on pylons like larks across dawn. But a small, stubborn countertext existed now beneath the west bank. Dates and a name, and the assertion, whispered like treason, that purity is not obedience if it requires a grave. You want a hook to hold through the night? Here. Centuries later, when the Englishman with the neat beard and the excellent notebook arrives, he will not find the shard first. He will see the open mouth and call it unusual. He will debate intention. He will weigh doctrine. He will miss, at least at the beginning, the sentence Kimu carved into clay like a man cutting a new channel for a flood. He will miss it because we always look at gold before we look at broken pottery. He will miss it until the light moves, and then the world will tilt. Breathe in the dust. You can almost taste it. Hot, chalky, ancient. The year is 1889, and Egypt is not ruled by pharaohs anymore, but by empires wearing new crowns. Steamships float where the sacred barks once sailed. Thebes, now Luxor, is a destination for the curious and the powerful, for those who want to touch eternity and photograph it before it crumbles. The desert is loud with shovels. The world, for the first time in thousands of years, is listening again. The man holding the map is Professor Charles Halden, an English archaeologist from Cambridge, who arrived that January on the same boat that carried crates of brandy and measuring rods. His journal records it plainly. January 12, 1889. Arrived Luxor by steamer. The locals speak of strange sounds near the ruins of Karnak. I suspect sand shifting over hollow chambers. The government permits excavation if we register our finds with the Antiquities Service. Excellent. He had no idea what waited under his boots. The dig began with the usual rhythm. Tents, sieves, men in linen working by the hour. The smell of camel sweat and kerosene. Halden's foreman, an Egyptian named Youssef Abdelkader, had grown up a few miles from the ruins. His father and grandfather had both worked in these sands. They knew where the ground rang hollow when you struck it. For days, they uncovered small things, fragments of pottery, pieces of amulets, a carved hand from a statue whose face was long gone. The air shimmered with heat and history. Then, on March 3, 1889, a pickaxe struck something that did not sound like stone. It sounded like a breath held too long. They brushed away the dust, slow as prayer, and found an engraved limestone block sealing a narrow passageway. Halden noted that the plaster around it was newer than the stone itself. A later sealing, he wrote, possibly an intrusive burial. He didn't know the word for what it really was. A cover-up. They set lamps in the sand. The wind died. The workers crossed themselves or whispered prayers to gods that hadn't been named aloud in centuries. The block came loose with a groan, and a breath of air escaped that had been trapped since before Rome was born. It smelled of myrrh, resin, and something metallic, something human. Inside, the torchlight found paintings first. Faded lotus blooms, eyes of Horus, symbols of protection. And then, beyond the threshold, the flicker caught a figure. A woman, wrapped in linen that had darkened to amber. Her arms were folded close, her fingers curled inward, her mouth open. Not the delicate gap left by embalmers, but an open cry frozen in time. Yusef dropped his torch. Even Halden, usually composed, wrote later, "The figure appears to have resisted, arms constrained, chest bound too tightly, wrappings hardened with resin. The posture is, I hesitate to write this, not restful." At the head of the stone table lay a small shard of pottery, wedged beneath the neck like a forgotten offering. Halden brushed the dirt away and squinted at the inscription. The ink had faded to the color of sand, but the script was unmistakably late New Kingdom hieratic. He copied it in his notebook. Year 1 of Usermatre Setepenre. They opened a wall made for silence and found the truth. Not a sin, a girl. Let any who read remember her name, Neferet. For the first time in 3 millennia, her name had been spoken aloud. Over the following weeks, the site became the obsession of every newspaper from London to Paris. Living mummy found at Thebes, screamed one headline. The woman who died twice. Another called her the Bride of Amun. Halden, though cautious, could not suppress his fascination. His letters to the British Museum tell the story better than any official report. It is clear this burial was not ritual in nature. The linen is layered while the body shows no incision for removal of organs. She was sealed alive, I must stress, alive. There are fingernail scores upon the inner surface of the resin shell. The purpose remains uncertain. I suspect religious punishment rather than disease or sacrifice, possibly accused of impurity. He didn't know her father's name. He didn't know Kimu's writing had survived because clay is kinder than conscience. He didn't know that the later sealing was not a restoration, but a mercy. But his hands trembled when he wrote her name. He said it aloud several times, each syllable making the tense air feel heavier. Neferet. Nefaret. It sounded like wind through stone. By April 1889, the chamber had been cleared. The linen-wrapped figure was transported under canvas to the Luxor Museum outpost, where a makeshift lab was built to study her. Halden described the process in clinical terms: temperature, humidity, catalog numbers. But his assistant, Margaret Dale, wrote something different in her personal diary. He speaks of her as specimen, yet looks at her as if she might wake. The men laugh to hide their unease. At night, the workers refuse to stay near the crate. They say the sand whispers. On the 5th night, a storm rolled in from the desert. Not rain, but wind and grit, thick as fog. The tents shook. Margaret claimed she heard a rhythmic sound between gusts, like breath, but slower. The locals refused to touch the mummy the next day. The dead don't rest when they die wrongly, Yusef said. Halden called it superstition, but in his notes he wrote, "Dust in the night, perhaps coincidence. Yet my dreams were peculiar. I saw a hall of columns, a man in priestly garb, and a wall bleeding sand. Woke at 3:12. When he examined the linen again under lamplight, he found faint watermarks along the edges, not from the flood, but from within. Tiny patterns where moisture had once pushed outward. And then, something stranger. Beneath the outermost layer of resin, pressed close to the chest, was a second inscription, likely added after the sealing but before the resin hardened. "Forgive us. The God hears nothing. May she find breath in silence." That line was written not by a scribe's stylus, but by a human fingertip tracing in still wet oil. A father's last prayer. Word of the find reached Cairo by May. Officials from the Antiquities Service ordered the remains transferred to the capital. Halden refused. It would destroy the preservation, he argued. But privately, he confessed to Margaret he feared something else entirely. Every artifact is a voice. This one screams. To move it would be to wake it. Yet he didn't mean curses or ghosts. He meant history itself, roaring up from the pit where it had been buried. When the crate finally left Luxor aboard a steamer for Cairo in June, half the workers stayed behind, demanding to be paid in advance. They wanted distance, not money. Margaret noted the silence of the deck that night. No one spoke until the boat rounded the bend of the Nile. Only then did the wind start again, carrying with it a sound that could have been the river, or breath. In Cairo, the mummy of Neferet was displayed in a side room of the old Bulak Museum, beside nameless kings and merchants. The label read, "Female, 19-25 years, late New Kingdom. Unusual burial, possibly priestess, cause of death, unknown." That was all. No mention of sin, love, or rebellion, just a line of dates and measurements. But every night, the guards swore the same thing. When the lamps dimmed and the building settled, they heard faint rustling from the display, as if the linen moves, one said. Halden dismissed it, until the night he heard it too. He never wrote about that in his reports. He only wrote cryptically, "The artifact resists silence." He died 2 years later of pneumonia caught during another excavation. His notes, however, survived, and with them, the translation of the shard, the words that carried across centuries from the hand of Kimu. In 1923, a young Egyptologist named Dr. Eleanor Rains revisited the Bulak archives. She found Halden's original journals, read the translations, and requested to see specimen number 4532, female unusual burial. But the record clerk frowned. "The mummy?" he said. "Destroyed. The flood of 1902. The Nile broke the walls of Bulak. Many crates swept away. Some never found." Eleanor spent the rest of her life trying to trace it, through rumors, private collections, auction lists. In a letter dated 1935, she wrote, "Everywhere I go, they remember her differently. The locals call her the girl who breathed too long. The Europeans call her the unquiet priestess, but they all lower their voices when they speak her name. And yet, her story refuses to vanish, because stories like hers never die. They haunt the silence that tried to erase them. When archaeologists dig, they believe they're unearthing the past. But sometimes, the past is unearthing us, forcing us to look, to remember what faith can do when it forgets compassion. Neferet's name is carved nowhere in stone now. It exists only in ink, on the brittle pages of Halden's journal and the clay shard that miraculously survived the flood. The shard rests today in a drawer of the British Museum, mislabeled as Late New Kingdom Ostracon, unverified context. Few know what it says. Fewer still know what it means. They opened a wall made for silence and found the truth. Not a sin, a girl. That is her epitaph. And if you listen closely, maybe the sand still remembers the sound of her last breath. That tiny act of defiance that outlived gods, kings, and the empires built on both. To those who listen tonight, would you have obeyed? Would you have stayed silent? Or would you have dared, like Kimu, to carve one forbidden truth into the wall, knowing no one might ever read it? History isn't only written by victors. Sometimes it's whispered by the buried. Neferet's silence became her voice. And 3,000 years later, we finally heard her. Picture this. The desert is no longer silent. It hums with machines now. Metal arms that scrape at the same sands men once touched with bare hands and prayers. In the spring of 2024, a team from the Luxor Archaeological project begins a survey near the old Karnak temple complex, using ground-penetrating radar to chart what lies beneath the surface. They are not looking for gods. They are looking for data, but the sand still remembers. The project lead is Dr. Nadia El Hassan, a 40-year-old Egyptologist raised in Luxor, fluent in hieratic and fluent, too, in the language of loss. She had grown up hearing her grandmother whisper about the girl who breathed too long. A myth, they said. The living mummy from the old British papers. A fable made to frighten children away from the ruins. But Nadia never forgot the tone in her grandmother's voice. The way she said the name, Neferet, as if saying it might wake the desert again. So when the radar scan showed a shallow void beneath the northeastern section of Karnak, precisely where Halden's 1889 map had recorded a collapsed side chamber, Nadia felt something stir that had nothing to do with science. The coordinates matched exactly. April 12, 2024, the dig begins. The modern world's hum, drones, generators, screens glowing with GPS coordinates, replaces the sound of reed flutes and temple chants. But beneath it, the desert breathes the same rhythm it did 3,000 years ago. 2 meters down, the excavators strike plaster, too smooth, too deliberate to be natural. Nadia kneels. The plaster flakes under her brush like snow. A faint line of inscription runs along the edge, not hieroglyphic, but hastily scratched hieratic, as if written by someone in a hurry, someone with more fear than time. She was offered to the god for the cleansing of sin. Nadia freezes. She has seen that phrase before, in the British archives, in Halden's letters, in the photograph of the lost shard that scholars dismissed as apocryphal. The handwriting is the same. This was the place. That night, under a full moon, the team sets lamps along the trench walls. Nadia reads aloud from Halden's 1889 transcription, her voice shaking. Year 1 of Uzurmatra Setepenre. They opened a wall made for silence and found the truth. Not a sin, a girl. Uzurmatra Setepenre, she whispers. Rameses II, meaning this chamber was sealed around 1279 BCE, almost exactly as the shard had claimed, meaning Neferet was real. April 16, 2024. The team unseals the chamber. The plaster breaks inward with a muffled sigh. The same sound Halden heard 135 years ago. The same breath Kimu once imagined escaping in the dark. Inside, the faint shimmer of gold foil, fragments of resin, a scattering of amulets shaped like tiny hearts, and then a slab. The remains are skeletal now, the linen eaten away by time. But the pose, the posture, is unmistakable. Arms bound close, fingers curled inward, the jaw slightly open. a protest that outlived breath. Nadia's assistant, Dr. Michael Rains, shines his flashlight toward the far wall and goes still. There, carved shallow into the limestone, are faint hieratic lines. Kimu's handwriting, the same angular tilt preserved in Halden's notes. Let any who read remember her name, Neferet. He had carved it twice, once on clay, once on stone, as if terrified the gods might erase both. Nadia feels tears sting her eyes behind the protective mask. She wasn't a myth, she says quietly. She was silenced. Michael's voice trembles. So the priests buried her alive? Nadia nods. They called it purification. She runs her fingers over the grooves of Kimu's script. Every letter is a heartbeat. For days, the team documents every inch of the find. Carbon dating confirms the linen traces belong to the late 13th century BCE. Chemical analysis reveals hardened resin layered over organic tissue, proof of mummification while the body was still alive. Historians call it the first physical evidence of ritualized live burial in ancient Egypt. But to Nadia, it's more than that. It's the first time a victim's story had been told, not by gods, but by those who dared to remember her. May 3rd, 2024. News breaks. The priestess who died alive. Archaeologists uncover evidence of forbidden ritual at Karnak. The headlines spread faster than sand in wind. Documentaries scramble, universities send experts, but Nadia avoids the cameras. She spends her evenings alone in the tent, reading the translation again and again. She dreams of a girl in linen, her eyes bright like the Nile at dusk. She dreams of the moment the air turned heavy and the gods turned away. And she wakes with the same sentence echoing in her mind. The god hears nothing. A month later, the team presents their findings at the Cairo Antiquities Conference. The room is silent as Nadia speaks. For centuries, Neferet's story was buried under fear. Fear disguised as faith. Her death was not divine will, but human obedience dressed in holiness. She was punished not for sin, but for being human, for loving, for questioning, for choosing truth over silence. There is a pause. Some clap politely. Others shift, uncomfortable. Because her words are not only about Neferet, they're about now. That evening, Nadia walks alone through the ruins. The wind hums through the broken pylons of Karnak, carrying echoes older than memory. She places a candle at the edge of the trench, where the sand meets the shadow of the temple, and whispers, "Your name is remembered." And for a moment, only a moment, the air feels warmer. The candle flame bends sideways, though there is no wind. A whisper stirs the sand, too faint for the microphones, too quiet for the skeptics. But Nadia hears it. It sounds like breath, like a girl waking after 3,000 years of silence. The excavation site is closed now. The artifacts are locked in temperature-controlled vaults, but at night, when the desert cools, the wind still slides through the broken stones and whispers one name, Neferet. And in the end, that is enough. Because she is no longer a myth, nor a curse, nor a relic. She is a voice that refused to die. What would you do if faith demanded your silence? Would you bow or breathe? This isn't just archaeology. It's confession carved in stone.